Mr. Mahon.
Thank you.
Sorry, my lord, are we going to be allowed to do the opening address now?
As you wish, or you want to do it when the defendant's witnesses comment.
We'll do it now.
Now.
Hopefully, yes, it will help to define the issues.
Yes. Mr. Mahon, you will have your turn in due course.
My lord, we're here to defend the constitutional principle that in a democracy, the state has a legitimate interest to protect the public against the use, possession, and dealing in harmful substances. We do so in the face of the constitutional attacks launched by the plaintiffs in this matter. Let's try and define the issues for the court in this matter. And we would like to start by indicating that in these proceedings, in our submission, the issues of whether or not cannabis has medicinal benefits or commercial and industrial uses do not arise for this fundamental reason. There is currently a legislative process before Parliament dealing with these exact issues. And that's in terms of the Medical Innovations Bill of 2014. I'm not sure if your Lordship has a copy of the bill.
I don't recall having it.
I'd like to start with the provisions of Section 2 of that bill, my lord, which sets out the purpose of the bill or the act, as it were. Section 2, subsection 3. It reads as follows. The purpose of this act are to, I skip 1 and 2, my lord, encourage responsible innovation in medical treatment and management by supporting reasonable, logical, clinical decisions. Subsection 4, deter reckless, illogical, and unreasonable departure from standard practice. And sub 5, which is very important for purposes of these proceedings, my lord. Legalize and regulate the use of cannabinoids for medical purposes and for beneficial commercial and industrial uses. My lord, this is the very process that the plaintiffs seek Parliament to engage in terms of their prayers, their main relief, my lord. File 1, page 33 of the pleadings, paragraph 26.5.
You said page 26.
Page 33 of the paginated papers. The plaintiff set out the relief that they seek, but this is the ultimate relief that they seek at paragraph 26.5, and it reads that the declaration of invalidity and the relief in consequence thereof be suspended for a period of 2 years to enable the legislature to pass appropriate legislation to regulate the cultivation, processing, distribution, sale, possession, and use of cannabis. And this is the exact process that Parliament has engaged in. May I refer your Lordship to the bill again at Section 7, which is also an important provision for the purposes of our submission. It says, notwithstanding any other law, but subject to the Constitution, no one shall be liable or guilty of any offense for growing, processing, distributing, using, prescribing, advertising, or otherwise dealing with or promoting cannabinoids for purposes of 1, treatment, and 2, commercial or industrial uses or products identified by the Minister of Trade and Industry in a proclamation of general application to be published in the Gazette. This is a very wide provision, my Lord, which seeks to decriminalize cannabis.
Within that limited, like you say, for medical and commercial or industrial uses. Is that
Yes,
correct?
commercial and industrial use.
Yes.
It may include anything, my Lord. Remember, my Lord, this is a parliamentary process which involves a public participation process where those interested may go and make submissions in terms of the bill, and they are not limited to what is outlined in the bill, my Lord. For example, some of the interested parties may approach Parliament and say, this bill is going too far. You need to restrict it. There are those who would say, the bill is not going far enough. You need to widen the scope of the intended legislation. All that we say, my Lord, is that there's a process in place and courts are required to respect that process, my Lord. May I refer your Lordship to the judgment of Glenister versus the President of the Republic of South Africa, 2009, Volume 2, BCLR 136. This is the Constitutional Court, my Lord. At paragraph 38, and it reads as follows. Judges, and thus the courts, in our constitutional order, have the duty to uphold and protect the Constitution. Section 38 of the Constitution provides that people may approach competent courts for appropriate relief in relation to the actual or threatened infringement of rights. This court has held that relief will not be appropriate unless it is effective. And this is the point we make, my Lord. Courts, therefore, are guardians of the Constitution. It is this role which we must bear in mind in addressing the question of whether this court may interfere before Parliament has concluded its work. Remember here, the bill is still underway. Paragraph 39. However, the Constitution is replete with provisions that make it plain that ordinarily a court will not interfere with the functioning of Parliament. For example, Section 1674B restricts the liability of all courts to pronounce on the constitutionality of parliamentary or provincial bills by providing that only the Constitutional Court may decide on the constitutionality of any parliamentary or provincial bill, but may do so only in circumstances anticipated in Section 79 or 121. I proceed because it's an important judgment, my Lord, because we raise the issue of mootness, whether there is a live issue to be determined by this court in the light of this legislation that is before Parliament, my Lord. Paragraph 40. In Doctors for Life, this court held that Section 1674B must be understood to mean that where a challenge to a bill is leveled in order to render it invalid, the only circumstances in which this court may entertain the challenge are those provided for in Section 79 or 121. Those sections relate to ascension of the bill or signing of the bill or permitting the president or the premier of a province to sign a bill into law, my lord. So it's not relevant for that purpose here. Paragraph 42. In considering this question, we should bear in mind the following two principles. On the one hand, the Constitution requires the courts to ensure that all branches of government act within the law. On the other, it requires courts to refrain from interfering with the autonomy of the legislature and the executive in the legislative process. What the plaintiffs are asking you to do, my lord, is to interfere with that process. But my lord, it gets worse. If you look at their answering affidavit to the striking out application, this is what they say at paragraph 8. These are the plaintiffs, my lord. And this was in response to the point made by the defendants that there's a legislative process in place before Parliament in terms of the medical innovation bill. This is what they say at paragraph 8, madam.
Paragraph, sorry.
Paragraph 8 of the defendants, respondents answering affidavit.
Yes.
It says the following, and this is very interesting, madam, and very critical. The fact that the medical innovation bill is presently before Parliament is of no moment. Of course they get it wrong. Indeed, it was originally sponsored by the late Member of Parliament, the Honorable Mr. M.G.R. Oriani Ambrosini in 2014 without being promulgated into law. Here comes the important point. The decision of this court will serve as guidance, my lord, for the legislature on what to avoid in order for the bill, when promulgated, to pass constitutional muster. So, my lord, they've come here to ask for guidance from this court, to ask for an opinion from this court about that legislation. They haven't taken any steps to attack that process that's before Parliament. They don't tell you what are the flaws with that parliamentary process. The law is clear, man. You don't use the courts for guidance or opinions. Courts are there to deal with real and live issues. So that the plaintiffs must await the finalization of that legislative process before they can institute any claim, my lord, concerning the nature and extent of the prohibition of the use and possession and dealing in cannabis. As I indicated, my lord, they have a right, in terms of the public participation process, to make representations, whatever representations, regarding the legalization of cannabis. So what are we to debate in this case, my lord? If Parliament is looking at that legislation concerning the decriminalization, legalization of cannabis for medicinal purposes, industrial use, or commercial use, my lord. fact, my Lord, we do not understand why we're here in the first place, in the face of that legislative process. We've referred to the Lannister, my Lord.
Yes.
It's a principle of separation of powers. That's what it is. So that this court cannot, in the middle of that process, dictate to Parliament on how to legislate the guidance that they are seeking from this court.
Yes.
Yes. It's a fundamental point, my Lord. My Lord, we are also not going to debate the issue of religious and cultural use of cannabis. That issue was determined by the Constitutional Court in Prince 2. The principle of res judicata on this point.
In which Prince?
Prince 2, the CC judgment, my Lord. Constitutional Court judgment.
Oh.
2002, yes, I'm talking. The issue of private use of cannabis is also pending before the Constitutional Court. And that matter will be heard on the 7th of November this year.
Is this the
Western Cape
appeal from the Western
Full Court?
Cape?
Yes.
Is that not confined to a more narrow issue?
Yes, private use. Yes, private use. I'm saying we can't debate private use. Issue of privacy.
Oh.
Yes. Well, given that background and scenario, what is left for debate? We don't know. Is the issue of use and dealing in cannabis perhaps unregulated and uncontrolled? But the plaintiffs say no, we don't want unregulated or uncontrolled use and possession of cannabis. We want a controlled and regulated legislative regime dealing with those issues of possession and dealing in cannabis. That's the issue before Parliament. But my Lord, if they seek to disavow the Medical Innovations Bill process in Parliament, what it means is that they'll be seeking to open up a door for uncontrolled drug dealing and use of cannabis by whomsoever and for whatever purpose. In our submissions, these proceedings have been launched by the plaintiffs, given our submission now, solely to escape the serious criminal charges that they are facing before the courts, my Lord. Now, my Lord, sometimes there is this propensity to seek legal answers and solutions, even to social, political, and as in this case, scientific issues. The result, my Lord, is that you may end up with hastily conceived solutions or answers, which may lead to untold consequences, my Lord. But that which the plaintiffs seek before this court, or what Parliament has to do in terms of their prayer, is already before Parliament. If that contemplated legislation is not enough, they should go and make representations before Parliament, give their input, Our submission is that there is no live issue to debate. And the issue of mootness is fundamental in our law, my lord. There are various judgments. The one point we have to mention in this context as well, my lord, is that before we deal with the issue of justification as raised by the plaintiffs, the plaintiffs must prove an infringement of their rights. The point is, the issue of justification does not arise unless and until an infringement of rights is established. If you are able to go beyond these points, this fundamental difficulty that the plaintiffs face, my lord, and this is part of our opening address, we are going to lead evidence of mothers who live and lead the fight of drug use, drug abuse, especially cannabis, my lord, in the informal settlements and the townships of this country, my lord. They will tell the real stories of how the scourge of drugs, especially cannabis, drug abuse, is ravaging our country. In places such as Mamelodi, not far from here, El Dorado Park, Kwamashu, Soshanguve, Langa, Sunnyside, you name any township. This is the real world that we live in. The real South Africa. Not another world, not another country, or a state in a country afar across the seas. All stories of people who live in the luxury of their farms and who scream from afar and for convenience the rights of the indigenous people who live in poverty and slums. Those mothers, my lord, who will be called as witnesses, will tell you about the children and the youth whose future has been dimmed and destroyed by drugs, especially cannabis, including the new generation drugs such as Nyaope, a concoction foreign to developed countries. You won't find it in America, you won't find it in England, you'll find it here. Of course, the plaintiffs will tell you about development in developed countries, developments around cannabis, with the aid of some pressure groups, but with little to offer by way of science. They will not tell you the stories of South Africa. We live in South Africa with our own history of deprivation, which we still live. We don't read about it. Poverty, unemployment, inequality. We have our own milieu, my lord. Crime, I could go on and on and on. We will also lead evidence of those who treat the ever-increasing number of individuals, especially young children, my lord, who have been harmed and destroyed by the use of cannabis. We'll also hear the evidence, my lord, of how the Medical Control Council, I think they have a new acronym now, approves and classifies medicines and drugs, and the importance of research as a bedrock of science, my lord. All with the aim of ensuring that the availability, all with the aim of ensuring the availability of safe medicines which is what is contemplated in the bill. My Lord, at the end of this trial, we hope to show this court, if we get there, that the impugned provisions achieve a legitimate government purpose, and that there is a rational connection between the prohibition of cannabis and that legitimate government purpose. We'll also show that any limitation of rights serves an important government purpose, and that is justifiable in terms of the Constitution. I'm at the tail end of my submissions, my Lord. We expect, in terms of trial procedure, the plaintiffs to testify first, my Lord, and establish facts on which the opinions of the experts are to be based. There is an important judgment in that regard, my Lord, of PricewaterhouseCoopers. I think it's at paragraph 80. That judgment was referred to you earlier, my Lord, during the submissions by
Paragraph?
80. So that, my Lord, this court may very well have to decide the issue of whether there is a life issue right at the beginning of this proceedings, my Lord, particularly given those constitutional court authorities. Those are submissions, my Lord.
Thank you, Mr. Bukawa. Mr. Willis.
As your Lordship pleases. My Lord, the plaintiffs, and correctly so we submit, have brought before your Lordship a number of defendants in this matter for obvious reasons, my Lord, relating to the facts of the plaintiffs' criminal prosecution. There is the National Director of Public Prosecutions, Minister of Justice, the Minister of Health, Minister of Social Development, Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Minister of Trade and Industry, Minister of Police. We note, my Lord, unfortunately not the Minister of Education, but the State can deal with that in due course in evidence, my Lord. The reason for that, my Lord, is this is possibly and there have been others, one of the most important cases to come before our courts, my Lord. The relief which the plaintiffs pray is far-reaching, both into our society and into the future generations, that we have an obligation to protect. Doctors for Life, my Lord, joined this case by order of this court because of their access to certain scientific evidence, and that forming the very basis on which they have become involved in public litigation in this country over the years. We've had at least one other citation to one of their reported matters, my Lord. But Doctors for Life take the obligation of future generations very seriously. It is not the attitude of Doctors for Life that there's no place for scientists to explore the medicinal attributes of cannabis. If they're there, they can, and they are there, my Lord, and they have been isolated and produced into medications which are accessible and which are effective and affordable. Doctors for Life, my Lord, ultimately contend that the plant as a whole has no future in medicine, because it's in gestation whether by smoke or the oils or by eating. And there are many forms into which it is now produced into an edible substance. That, my Lord, all of those give rise to psychoactive effect on the brain and damage. So, my Lord, you would have noted from the pleadings that Doctors for Life, just bear with me, at page 60, my Lord, paragraph 9.
Is this of the pleadings?
Of the pleadings. In their plea, my Lord, they deny the plaintiff's case. And they plead that the consumption of cannabis is dangerous and injurious for human consumption. My Lord, whatever the scientists, wherever they may leave the ball for your Lordship to pick up and make assessments on evidence, your Lordship, we submit, will find that it is sufficiently harmful for it to be prohibited. Lord, the approach, as you will read from the expert, our main expert, who we will lead, my Lord, is that the current prohibitions of marijuana are strongly supported by valid scientific research and medical evidence. Your Lordship heard something somewhat different from counsel for the plaintiffs. The science strongly supports the conclusion that marijuana has a high potential for abuse, has no currently, my Lord, accepted medicinal use, and that sufficient assurances of safety for use of cannabis under medical supervision are lacking. The science strongly supports the conclusion that cannabis has met and continues to meet the criteria for prohibition. Continued legislative prohibition in the possession and use of cannabis by adults sorry, my Lord, is irrational, and it is rational and necessary that cannabis remain on the list of substances listed in Part 3 of the Schedule 2 to the Drugs and Drug Trafficking Act, and equally in Section 21 of the Medicines and Related Substances Act. And my Lord, there are three rational factors which determine whether a substance belongs on a prohibition list from a scientific perspective, my Lord. They are that the drug or other substance has a high potential for abuse. And your Lordship will hear the evidence of witnesses who have fallen prey to that vice. The drug or other substance has no currently accepted medical use in treatment. There are some highly addictive substances, my Lord, that are found biologically in nature that are available medicinally because they have medical use. Cannabis has not reached that point in time, but our learned friends for the State Departments, my Lord, have made submissions on the bill to you, and I'm not going to repeat any of those.
Yes.
And my Lord, lastly, there is a lack of accepted safety for use of the drug or other substance under medical supervision. My Lord, there will also be evidence will be dealt with on whether the legalization of cannabis does or does not result in reduced substance abuse and improvement of social interests. Because, my Lord, simple fact is that once it is legalized, as is seen in other parts of the world, business clamors for the interests of a demand for a drug which, once it addicts you, has you and continues to empty your life and your financial means, to destroy your families. It would be wonderful, my Lord, if it was possible to control it and allow those who do have the capacity to use it recreationally or otherwise in a controlled fashion. That would be ideal. But as our learned friend Mr. Bakabe SC said, this is the real world, my Lord. My Lord, in the recent World Drug Report of 2017, and reading from the executive summary, the conclusion and policy implications prepared by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, that's the official name, my Lord, it is concluded that medical use of cannabis needs a scientific approach. Research has shown that notwithstanding the usefulness of some cannabinoids, in the management of specific medical conditions. Their use, particularly in the botanical form of herbal cannabis with unknown content and dosage, can be detrimental to health. To protect human health, it is therefore necessary that the principles of safety, quality, and efficacy, and the rigorous scientific testing and regulatory systems that apply to established medicines be applied also to cannabis-based medicines. My Lord, at best, those are matters for the legislature, as has been submitted to you. My Lord, cannabis, marijuana, dacha, as we note, my Lord, gives rise to cognitive degradation. It intoxifies and impairs the higher brain function. Our witness will tell you how she has dedicated her life to the science and study of drug addiction and drugs, my Lord, and in the case of marijuana, because it is the enemy of the brain. It impairs learning and working memory. It reduces attention span and concentration. It reduces ability to plan, reduces organizational skills, reduces problem solving, reduces decision making, reduces perception of facts, reduces emotional control, reduces behavioral control, impairs motor coordination, increases impulsivity. It is said that in certain supposed medical tests, whether they pass muster or not, leaving that aside, that it improves hunger or increases hunger, that in the case of HIV. But my Lord, one of the notorious symptoms of drug addiction and cannabis is more akin to emaciation than to someone carrying more weight than not. Lord, we must pose the question why the plaintiffs in your Lordship's court have not rested their cause with the judgment of Davis J. and his two brothers, one brother, I think one sister. We're not certain. We'll wait to hear from them why that is not adequate in all the circumstances. But, my Lord, we would suggest on the facts before your Lordship, it is because ultimately what they hope for is to deal legitimately and legally in cannabis, in the commercialization of cannabis. There are very specific facts specifically pleaded in the particulars of claim. Not all the detail and the evidence is there, but it's pleaded how they were caught and arrested, etc. It is common cause, my Lord. If not common cause, it will be established. They were caught with 1.87 kilograms of dacha. That is somewhere in the region of 480 to 500,000 rands in value, street value. They now come on personal specified facts before your Lordship in order to escape prosecution. They're entitled to do that, my Lord. But, my Lord, is this matter really in the interests of the public? Is this truly public interest litigation? Lord, I'm informed that the 1.87 grams or kilograms of marijuana could keep one person smoking a few joints a day for up to 8 years in supply. And then, my Lord...
Is that what one of your witnesses are going to testify?
We'll
You
deal with
said
that.
you are informed.
Yes, yes. I don't know if the calculation is correct, but we'll get to that and it can be tested,
Yes,
my Lord.
because this is an opening address.
Yes, it is, my Lord. It is an opening address, my Lord. My Lord, your plaintiffs before your Lordship also applied only after some 20 to 30 years of indulgence. We've had a democratic dispensation for more than 20, or on 20 now, my Lord. But why that is relevant, my Lord, is that, and I think Mr. Bokaba has alluded to this, is that it is for them to establish their right before your Lordship by way of evidence. Our learned friend made the submission that prima facie part of their case is common cause on the pleadings. We disagree. My Lord, the fact that they were arrested, and he referred only to the arrest, does not prove any right other than possibly, at best, my Lord, Section 12, liberty and freedom of person, at best. But all the other, I think he said there were 12 different instances relied on, must be proved. And my Lord, there is certainly no shift in onus. Your Lordship will recall that I made reference to the authority of Strantham Ford, the SCA, during the course of the last 2 days, my Lord. The judgment of His Lordship, Mr. Justice Wallace, and it's that matter, once again, is very, very instructive, where parties come before court on personal facts. The problem, my Lord, is that we're not going to hear from the plaintiffs first. And one wonders how that benefits the public, whose interests have been protected by your Lordship's ultimate order in relation to media access.
As I understand it, they will testify, just that not at the beginning.
So that might be so.
Yes.
But we are going to traverse, and you've heard our submissions in regard to the summaries. We are now going to traverse matters pertaining to HIV, particularly with Dr. Abrams, the relevance of which we don't know, because not one of these plaintiffs before you suffers from HIV, let alone schizophrenia. There's no factual basis being laid first. So we're going to have to hear hearsay evidence from these experts in relation to the factual basis. And my Lord, with reference back to the PwC authority, my Lord, we are going to find ourselves with a dearth of evidence, much of it hearsay, in relation to matters of no relevance. And so in the course of that evidence, my Lord, we will do our best to object appropriately and redirect matters where we can, and hopefully the experts can be of great assistance to us in any joint minute they may provide in due course. My Lord, the Davis judgment we submit is not binding on your Lordship. It may have been a full bench decision, my Lord, but it is a decision which must yet be confirmed. Even if it were a Supreme Court of Appeal decision, its need for confirmation, my Lord, unfortunately renders it not binding. My Lord, the evidence will show ultimately there is no trend towards either legalization or decriminalization and regulation of the use of cannabis in societies. That is not the case. And those changes, my Lord, bar one or two have all come about by ballot or legislation. Lord, you'll also hear the evidence of a Professor Emeritus Forensic Psychiatrist for Doctors for Life, whose evidence has already been accepted by the Constitutional Court on the effects of cannabis and its dangers. Lord, ultimately the Doctors for Life intends and hopes to be of assistance to your Lordship in the scientific process. Of course, we have aligned, Doctors for Life has aligned itself in the plea with what is pleaded in the first to seventh defendants pleading.
Yes.
I think you saw that.
Yes.
It's done in a catch-all provision, my Lord. So we will be venturing in evidence into those areas too. Lord, that will be the case for Doctors for Life. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Willis. Mr. Mohammed.
Thank you, Lord. The plaintiffs would then proceed to call their first witness, Professor David Nutt.
Yes.
Lord, the witness has indicated his preference to taking an affirmation rather than an oath.
Yes. It's to do the truth.
My name is David John Nutt. I'd like to take the affirmation.
Do you affirm that the election about the case will be in true, false, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Professor Nutt, do you prefer doctor or professor?
I don't mind.
Feel free to take a seat if you feel uncomfortable.
Thank you. I have bad knees.
Professor Nutt, could we start off by asking you to please explain to the court what it is that you do?
I am a psychiatrist. I am Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial College London. That is an endowed chair that allows me to study the effects of drugs on the brain. I have worked for 40 years in research. I have studied almost every class of drug that is used in psychiatry, including many drugs which are so at present illegal, and I've tried to understand the mechanisms of action of these drugs, their therapeutic utility, and also the reasons why people might abuse them.
Broadly speaking, what sort of studies have you done in regard to those aspects?
I have done a range of different studies. I am what some people would consider an experimentalist. I give people drugs and I look at the effects of those drugs on their brain and on their behavior and on the medical outcomes. But also, for the last 20 years, I've had a significant interest and involvement in looking at the comparative harms of different drugs. I have developed methodologies for doing that, and so I think it would be fair to say a significant proportion of my academic recognition is now through that kind of research, in addition to my scientific studies of the brain.
I understand you to say comparative harm of different drugs.
That's right, my lord. Yes.
If I could turn you, I believe there's an open file in front of you. It should be file 2 of 6.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically to page 149 of that file. Do you recognize the document before you, Professor Nutt?
This is my CV. Yes.
Have you reread the document recently?
I have.
Is it a correct reflection of your qualifications?
It is.
I'd like to go through some of the contents of the CV with you. Under present position on page 149, it says the Edmund J. Safra Chair in Neuropsychopharmacology. Could you explain that to us, please?
So the Safra Foundation is a well-known international foundation that supports biomedical research. And 8 years ago, they funded a chair at Imperial College to allow me to move there and continue my research there. I was at Bristol University for 20 years before then. And my research is in the study of drugs on the brain in neurological as well as psychiatric disorders.
What is it that qualifies you to speak on neurological and psychiatric disorders?
Well, I trained as a neurologist first and then as a psychiatrist subsequently. My PhD is in pharmacology, and so those three come together in neuropsychopharmacology.
What is it, would you say, that you are best known for?
Internationally, I'm best known for my work on comparative drug harms, the analysis of the harms of different drugs using techniques which I've pioneered and then developed with the expertise of others.
And how is it that you became to be known internationally in this regard?
30 years ago, I was working at the National Institute of Health in the USA, and I was running the research ward for patients with alcohol dependence there. I ran that for 2 years. And during that time, it became clear to me that alcohol was a very significant problem, causing serious brain as well as bodily damage to people. And I began to get interested in the question of why alcohol was actively marketed, whereas other drugs, which perhaps some of my patients were using, were actually illegal. And it seemed to me that what we needed to do as scientists at that time was to develop strategies for properly assessing the harms of different drugs, with a view to understanding those harms, both from the perspective of the drug and also from the perspective of how different approaches to the drug might impact on those harms. So that has been influential in the sense that in some countries now, tobacco and alcohol are no longer advertised because the health community has lobbied in many countries to remove that advertising as a way of reducing demand and therefore reducing consumption. As a result of that interest, I've written several chapters in books about that. I was invited to join a very influential British committee led by Viscountess Runciman. The Runciman report was published in 2000, and it was the first serious review of the British drug laws that had taken place in 30 years. It was an extremely well-received review. I was the medical expert on that panel. And during the process of writing that review, we developed the first prototypical scale for assessing drug harms. That report received a lot of commendation from the media as well as scientists. And as a result of that, I was asked to join the government's committee, the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, to help the government look at the harms of drugs and to help them arbitrate on the appropriate classification of drugs and decisions as to whether drugs should be made illegal or not. I served on that committee for 9 years as head of the expert panel that looked at pharmacology and toxicology, the so-called technical committee. This was a committee that looked at the science of drugs. And during that time, I developed new methodologies for assessing the comparative harms of different drugs. Those techniques were used within the Home Office, which is our Ministry of Homeland Decisions, including at that time lawmaking. So we used the expertise of the police, as well as teachers and other medical experts and across a range of disciplines to validate the first prototypical assessment scale. That proved very appealing to the Home Office at the time. The scale was validated by reference to the addiction psychiatrists who were members of the Royal College of Psychiatry. And in 2007, that data was published in The Lancet, which is the leading medical journal, as the first attempt to systematically compare the harms of drugs using a transparent and validated scale. That particular article became very heavily referenced and cited, and it led to a professor at the London School of Economics called Larry Phillips approach me with an understanding of how it could be improved. And I met with him and with the head of the British Medical Research Council to discuss how we could take this approach forward. And we were educated into this technique called multi-criteria decision analysis, which is a relatively new approach developed by economists and psychologists to help people make decisions in areas where there is limited data, and also where there is data across a different set of parameters. So as you can imagine, when we're looking at the harms of drugs, on one hand we have the harm of what a drug might do. Were you to take it today, if you were to take a dose of this drug, what harm would that have on you? And then of course that grades from taking it once to taking it repeatedly to becoming dependent on it. But then there are many other dimensions of drug use. So there's the impact of using that drug on your family and on society, and the economic cost of using a drug, and the economic costs of treating people for using drugs, and the road traffic accidents that drug use might lead to, and the secondary consequences of the way in which you use drugs. For instance, as you know, using drugs through the intravenous route is one of the main reasons why HIV can take hold and be spread. So as a result of that conversation, the Medical Research Council in Britain and the Home Office, who I was still working with at the time, they funded a conference to evaluate what the harms of drugs were across the whole spectrum, from economic harm right through to the personal harm of a drug being used just once. And that conference led to our understanding that in fact there are 16 ways in which a drug can do harm. There are 9 harms to the user, and there are 7 harms to society. And from then on, we have used this multi-criteria decision analysis, the MCDA approach, to assess the harms of drugs. And we have conducted several studies, including one recently in South Africa, looking at different drugs and also different formulations of the same drug. And this has now become accepted, I believe, as the international standard for making decisions about drug harms.
Turning back to page 149 of your CV, under the heading Overview, we've dealt with the fact that you are currently the Edmund J. Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology, Head of the Centre for Neuropsychopharmacology in the Division of Brain Science, Department of Medicine, Hammersmith Hospital, Imperial College, London. It says you are also a visiting professor at the Open University in the UK and Maastricht University in the Netherlands. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
In the next paragraph, it says that you completed your clinical training at Guy's Hospital in London. What did that training involve, and what is Guy's Hospital in London?
Well, Guy's Hospital is well, I would have said at the time, the leading teaching hospital in London, if not Britain. That was a clinical training as a medical student, 3 years of clinical experience on the wards.
After a period in neurology to MRCP. What is MRCP?
That is the higher qualification in neurology. So that is a specialist qualification in medicine that opens the door to becoming a specialist neurologist.
It says you moved to Oxford to a research position. Explain that to us, please.
So in Oxford, the MRC, the Medical Research Council in Britain, had set up a unit called the MRC Clinical Pharmacology Unit under Professor David Graham Smith. And that was the leading research unit in the country interested in how drugs work in the brain. So I was fortunate in persuading Professor Graham Smith to take me on to do my PhD there.
Is that what you refer to where you say where you obtained your DM?
Yes, a Doctor of Medicine is an Oxford higher degree in medicine. It's a subject, it's awarded on the basis of submitting a thesis, a research thesis like a PhD.
And upon completing your psychiatric training in Oxford, what happened then?
I became a Wellcome Senior Fellow. That is the highest level of fellowship you can achieve in the UK as a research scientist, clinical research scientist. And then I was approached by the National Institute of Health in America to go to NIH to run the research ward on the alcohol abuse unit. And I went there for 2 years thinking I might stay there, but I didn't stay because unfortunately the Americans didn't recognize the British medical qualification. And they wanted me to go back and redo medicine there as a junior resident, which I thought was inappropriate for my level of expertise and knowledge. So then I moved back to England.
When was that?
So I moved back to England in 1988 to the University of Bristol, where I set up a unit called the Psychopharmacology Unit to study the psychiatric and psychoactive effects of drugs on the brain.
Just broadly, if you could assist us by explaining those concepts, psychiatric and psychoactive effects.
So I'm a practicing psychiatrist. I'm a medical doctor. I'm a trained specialist in psychiatry. I treat patients with a range of different psychiatric disorders. My particular specialty in psychiatry is the use of medicines, drugs. It's because I'm an expert in drugs. So I ran what was called the National Psychopharmacology Clinic. I treated people from all over the country, sometimes over Europe, with difficult to treat psychiatric and neurologic disorders who could benefit from the use of drugs. But I also researched how these drugs work. So I developed some of the first insights into how lithium, the mood stabilizer, works, how antidepressants work, how anxiolytics work, and also pioneered the use of buprenorphine, Subutex as it's sometimes known, in the treatment of opiate dependence, and did a lot of research on the optimal way of using pharmacology to help people with opiate dependence problems.
My Lord, if the witness is going too fast, my Lord, please,
No, it's fine.
you'll guide us. Thank you, my Lord. It then says, you returned to England to set up the Psychopharmacology Unit in Bristol University, an interdisciplinary research grouping spanning the departments of psychiatry and pharmacology before moving to Imperial College London. Tell us about that.
Well, Imperial College London is one of the top universities in the world, as you probably know. I had been a visiting professor there for 15 years, and actually a lot of my research was done there. But that involved me taking patients all the way from Bristol to London on the train or on driving them in the mornings. And when they made me an offer in 2008 to move there, it was a bit easier to do the research because we could recruit patients locally from London rather than have to recruit from Bristol and then take them to and fro. And it was quite arduous for the patients, of course, as well, because it's 3 hours each way, and if there's no problems on the motorway.
It says there you lead a similar group with a particular focus on brain imaging, especially PET.
Yes, so PET stands for positron emission tomography. It is the most sophisticated way of looking into the brain we have. It allows us to ask questions about what drugs do in the brain and where they do it. So, for instance, I did the first study that asked the question, where does a drug like, you've probably heard of diazepam, a benzodiazepine that calms people, helps them sleep. We did the first study to see where this drug worked in the brain, where the receptors, the targets for this drug were in the brain, and how these receptor targets were different in people who had anxiety disorders compared with who didn't have anxiety. So we were able to show that people who were very anxious had a deficiency in their brain of the receptors which were necessary to calm them down. So this was the first proof that a psychiatric disorder like anxiety had a brain substrate which could explain it.
What is the European Brain Council?
So the European Brain Council is an organization which was set up, I think 12 years ago now. It was set up at the request of the European Commission, which is the overarching administrative body for the 27 states of Europe. And it is essentially the decision-making alongside the European Parliament. It's the decision-making part, the heart of the European community. And about 13 years ago, they made it clear to the brain science community, to psychiatrists, to neurologists, to patient advocacy groups, that there were so many of them, and there were so many disorders relating to the brain, and there were so many groups trying to talk to them and promote their demands for or requests for brain research or more investment in treatment, that they were overwhelmed. So they said that they wanted to rationalize their interaction with the medical communities, and they requested all the people involved in anything to do with brain medicine to form an organization called the Brain Council. And in a similar way, there's a council for cardiovascular disease, there's a council for cancer, and these councils represent Europe to the Commission. So the European Brain Council, I served on it for 5 years, and then 3 years ago was made president. And so I do what presidents do, which is I chair meetings and help direct policy.
And the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs?
So the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs is a UK committee. I set it up in 2009 when, after a well-documented and well-reported falling out between me and my government, I was dismissed from my post as the head of the Advisory Council, the Drugs Advisory Group, and almost all the other scientists on the council resigned in protest because my dismissal was occasioned by a disagreement about comparative harms. My research at that point had shown that our drug laws were not based on science. And our Misuse of Drugs Act, 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, specifically says that the control of drugs should be based on scientific evidence. And when it was clear that our act was in breach of its own principles, in that drugs were being controlled inappropriately, I presented that to the government. And their response was, well, we'd rather not know those facts. And I thought that was unacceptable, unscientific, and over the course of the year I was a chairman of that council, tried to work with separate Home Secretaries, the ministers in charge, to get them to see that the purpose of the Act was being undermined by actively ignoring the scientific evidence. And eventually they became irritated by my pressures, criticisms. An election was coming up and they decided they'd have more chance if they sacked me. They didn't win the election, but I was no longer their advisor. As a result of that, I was approached by various charities and asked to continue my work, which was seen as landmark. And so I set up this independent committee, the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs, which now is called drugscience.org.uk.
And do you hold any position at that committee?
Well, I'm currently the chair of that committee.
Can you tell us about some of the other members of that committee?
So the other members of that committee are the senior scientists who were on the government's advisory committee. So I say with only one exception, they all resigned and they've all joined my committee. So I have experts in toxicology, in forensic medicine, in veterinary medicine, in pharmacology, in psychology, in epidemiology, in drug policy, in criminology. It's an hugely powerful expert group. It's, in essence, the top experts in drugs and drug addiction in the UK.
Tell us about the British Neuroscience Association.
My research involves the brain. That brain research is often called neuroscience research. The British Neuroscience Association is an organisation that promotes British neuroscience. British neuroscience is one of the leading claims that Britain has to being at the top, very top table in terms of science. British neuroscience is recognised around the world as being one of the major outputs of British science. We have an organisation called the British Neuroscience Association which represents neuroscientists, and I was very pleased to be elected president of that a few years ago, and I served that post for 2 years with the role of trying to promote particularly young people coming in and staying in neuroscience, because research is becoming quite challenging now in most Western countries as funding is harder to come by, particularly after the financial crash. So I took that job on to try to see if we could keep waving the flag for neuroscience, because British neuroscience has won more Nobel Prizes than any other branch of science in Britain, apart from physics. And it's, as I say, it's one of the areas where Britain still is absolutely world leading.
The Royal Colleges of Physicians.
So, yes, I was a physician, I am a physician, so I've been elected a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and a Fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, because I'm a psychiatrist too.
What is the significance of being a Fellow of these organisations?
Being a Fellow means that you've achieved a certain status in the eyes of your colleagues. So it's usually awarded after about 20 years of practice in the field.
So you're a Fellow of the Royal Colleges of Physicians, of Psychiatrists, and of the Academy of Medical Sciences.
Yeah, the Academy of Medical Sciences was set up about 19 years ago now, as a parallel to the Royal Society. The Royal Society was, as you probably know, was founded 400 years ago to promote science in the United Kingdom, and it was the first of the great international scientific societies. But it was largely looking at basic science, and about 20 years ago the government set up or started the process to set up an Academy for Medical Sciences to mirror the Royal Society. So it's the top 1,000 medical scientists in Britain form the Academy of Medical Sciences, and its role is to guide the government in terms of health policy and health research.
What is the European Certificate and Masters in Affective Disorders courses?
Well, that is a course that I am the UK representative on that course. It's the first international or European Masters in Psychiatry that has ever been set up, and it's basically a training course to try to bring European psychiatrists together to learn about, particularly about anxiety and depressive disorders, because those tend to be poorly taught to trainees in psychiatry and psychology, where the focus is often more on disorders like schizophrenia.
Why would you say they are poorly taught?
Well, because in terms of the pecking order for medical investment, disorders like schizophrenia get much more government funds than disorders like depression. And anxiety is virtually unfunded because so many people think that anxiety is not a disorder. It's just something you have, you know, when you're taking your driving test. But as I say to people, just imagine what, you know, that experience you had when you were taking your first major exam. Imagine that just happening out of the blue for no reason one morning, which is what many of my patients experience. Imagine how debilitating that is. And when you understand that, then you realize that anxiety disorders are a huge problem.
The International Centre for Science in Drug Policy?
Yes, I was asked to join that a few years ago, and I was pleased to do that because having done this work to look at how drugs harm and to develop rational ways of scaling harms, it seems sensible to work with other international experts.
What is the Journal of Psychopharmacology?
The Journal of Psychopharmacology is a research journal. It publishes research papers in the field of psychopharmacology. It is a journal of my national association, the British Association of Psychopharmacology, which I was once president. And it's one of the leading journals in the world for people who wish to publish studies on the effects of drugs and the brain.
And your involvement with that journal?
I'm the editor of that journal. I have been for nearly 20 years now.
And the British National Formulary?
So the British National Formulary is the pharmaceutical formulary that is used by the National Health Service. So it's essentially a book of drugs. It's updated every 6 months. And for a very long time now, I've been one of the 2 advisors on psychiatric drugs. So my role there is to make sure that what the formulary says about these drugs is correct. The formulary is actually produced by the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, by pharmacists, but they rely on medical experts to ensure that there's not any mismatch between what the pharmacists say and what doctors do in practice. So I check the depositions and I make sure that the science that's behind it is up to date.
Tell us about your publications, if any.
Well, I've published, as it says here, over 400 original research papers, so those are independent pieces of research. I've published over 500 reviews and book chapters. I've published 8 government reports on drugs, and actually it's now 30 books, including one which I focused at the general public called Drugs Without the Hot Air, which won the Transmission Prize for communicating science to the public in 2014.
What is the Transmission Prize?
The Transmission Prize is a relatively recent prize set up by a group of individuals who are non-scientists, but who wanted to learn more about the nature and the process of science. In the last 10 years, science has become rather fashionable in Britain, and there are people who go to hear scientists speak in the way they might go and hear theatre critics speak or novelists speak. And this organisation, it was called the Salon Project, organises a series of lectures by scientists throughout the year. And then every year they give this award called the Transmission Prize for the book that best communicates science to the general public.
Just tell us broadly some of the topics covered in these 30 books that you've published.
So I have written books across this field of psychopharmacology. I've written or edited. I mean, mostly these books are edited. They're not written by me. I edit them. I contribute chapters. I've written 2 definitive books on post-traumatic stress disorder, the definitive book on anxiety disorders, a very major book on drug abuse and drug mechanisms, which came out of one of the government reports I worked on. I've written more educational books on addiction and psychiatry and psychopharmacology.
it says that you have been a member and chair of the advisory committee on the misuse of drugs.
Yes, that was the point I was making earlier on. So that was where I developed my knowledge and interest in drug harms, and I was on that committee for 10 years, 9 years as chair of the scientific committee, and then 1 year as the full chair of the council.
And the British Association of Psychopharmacology?
So that is the founding organisation of the Journal of Psychopharmacology, and I was president of that for 2 years.
The European College of Neuropsychopharmacology?
So that is a European college that covers the discipline of neuropsychopharmacology. It's been running now for nearly 30 years. It's the largest neuropsychopharmacology organisation in the world. At its peak, it was getting over 7,000 delegates to its meetings, and I was president of that for 3 years.
It says you're a member of the HEFCE/NHS Senior Lecturer Selection Panel. And
yes, that is the Higher Education Funding Council for England. So that's a panel that made awards to individuals who were looking to become promoted to research senior lecturers.
And member of the MRC Neuroscience Board.
So the Medical Research Council is the main funder for brain research in Britain. It's also the main funder of all medical research. So the brain research is funded through an organisation called the Neuroscience Board, which consists of about 20 scientists appointed for 3 years who review applications and then rank them and make decisions on what gets funded and what doesn't.
And then it says you served as the medical expert on the Independent Inquiry into the Misuse of Drugs Act 2000. Is it Runciman?
That's right. So that was a report I mentioned earlier on in how my career developed. I was appointed to that as the medical expert, and that's where I began to develop the prototypical drug assessment scheme that I have refined over the last 20 years.
What was the inquiry? Tell us about the inquiry.
So the inquiry was the first systematic review of the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act that had happened in the UK. It was funded by a charity called the Police Foundation, who were concerned that the drug laws were not serving the purpose that they were initially set up to enact, and in fact, they might be leading to some cases of injustice rather than justice. Lady Runciman was a very senior member of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. She'd served on that. She had been influential in persuading our Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, to change her policy on needle exchange, and that made Britain one of the world leading countries in terms of needle exchange for heroin addiction. She was a remarkable woman, chair of a major NHS trust, and she was a very impressive chairperson for this inquiry. The inquiry lasted for 18 months, had expertise ranging from philosophers through lawyers, through members of the public, and me as a doctor. And the report was seen as a landmark assessment of the state of the Drugs Act in the country at the time.
What was the outcome of the inquiry?
The inquiry was reported very widely in the media. It encouraged the government to set up its first ever review of the scheduling of cannabis. At the time of the Runciman report, cannabis, depending on its formulation, was either in Class A, the most penalised class, or Class B, the second most penalised class of our Misuse of Drugs Act. And as a result of the inquiry, which essentially pointed out the anomalies in the choice of class for cannabis, we recommended cannabis be removed to Class C. And several years later, the government set up, through the Advisory Council, a separate committee, which I also served on, which concurred with the Munson report, and cannabis was downgraded in 2004. And to this day, it's the only time that a drug has been reclassified downwards under the Misuse of Drugs Act in the UK. Tens of drugs have had their classification increased, but the Act was supposed to allow free movement up and down according to harm assessment, and that cannabis is the only drug that has ever been downgraded.
What are the implications of it being downgraded from Class A to Class C?
Well, the downgrading had one major implication, which was that the penalties for possession were significantly reduced from 7 years to 2 years, and similarly the penalties for dealing were reduced from life imprisonment to 14 years. Those are maxima.
The Committee on Safety of Medicines?
So the Committee on Safety of Medicines is the medical equivalent of the British National Formulary, but it has a greater role than that, because that is the committee that decides whether a drug will be allowed as a medicine in Britain. So it determines whether the efficacy and the safety of a drug meets the criteria for it to be used as a medicine in Britain. So it's the British equivalent of what the Americans call the FDA.
That would be the
Federal
Drug
Agency, that's right. So I served on that, and I was one of the 2 psychiatric members of that committee, and so my role was to assess drugs such as would treat psychiatric and neurologic and pain disorders. And actually, and this may be of interest to the courts, I was on that committee when Sativex, the combination medicine of THC and cannabidiol, was first presented as a possible medicine. So I'm well aware of the issues relating to cannabis products as medicines.
Tell us about Sativex. What is it? What is it for?
So Sativex is an extract. Sativex is a spray. It's a liquid spray that you spray into your mouth, and it contains a combination, and I can't remember precisely, but I think it's 3. I think each spray, each shot, contains, I think, 3.4 milligrams of THC. This is the active, the stoning ingredient in cannabis, but also one of the main reasons why cannabis is a pain reliever and an antispastic agent. It also contains just a bit less of this other substance called cannabidiol. Now, cannabidiol is a non-psychoactive component of the cannabis plant, which seems to have medical properties of its own, particularly relating to spasticity, epilepsy, and maybe brain stress. But when used with THC, it moderates the stoning effect, the high that the THC can produce. So it's at a low level, it's a kind of antidote or balancing agent to the THC.
The Committee on NHS Drugs?
That is a committee that decides whether a drug which has been approved by the Committee of Safety of Medicines. The Committee of Safety of Medicines will say this drug is allowable in the United Kingdom. But then the Committee on NHS Drugs decides whether the NHS will pay for it. So the NHS committee might well decide, well, this new drug is an efficacious drug, but it's no better than these 3 other drugs we've got already, which are cheaper, so we're only going to pay for the cheaper ones and not the new one. And that committee was set up to get around the problem of what we call Me Tooism, and that in some indications you might have 10 different variants of the same drug. And the ones that come in first usually are, when they're on the market for a certain time, they become lower in price, they become generic. and then companies come along at the end with newer ones with slightly different claims, much more expensive. So we had to decide whether the newer drugs were cost effective, and if they were, we put them into the NHS list, but if they weren't, we didn't.
The Ministry of Defence Science Advisory Board.
Yes, so I was an expert on that committee for several years. I mean, obviously, defence science is not just about weapons and about armour. One of the biggest challenges the military face are the psychological consequences of warfare. As I said, I've edited 2 major books on post-traumatic stress disorder. I was working on this committee to try to help the military develop the most appropriate research strategy for the prevention and treatment of disorders like PTSD.
The UK Government Foresight Initiative, Brain Science, Addiction and Drugs. Tell us about that.
So the UK government, in about 2000, set up the Foresight Group. The Foresight Group takes 2 challenges each year. It sets up committees which run for about 2 years to address topics that are believed to be are likely to be of significant relevance to the UK over the next 25 years. So they deal with topics like flood defences, like global warming, like terrorism. And then in 2004 they decided to set up a group to look at the way science would affect the use and the misuse and the harms of drugs over the next 25 years. That was a very interesting committee to work on. That report was a landmark report. In fact, it's one of the very few ones of these that's actually been turned into a book for the public, because we said things like the internet within 10 years will be the major source of drug dealing. At that time, people really never considered the internet as having any relationship to drugs, because drugs were things that were dealt around at the back of clubs and the back of pubs. And of course we were right. The internet is now the most influential element in the use of many drugs. And we also showed how brain science could be useful in terms of developing new treatments, and how we had to develop new strategies. So this became not a blueprint, but it became the test bed against which government policies on drugs and drug addiction should be tested over the next 25 years.
To what extent did your involvement in these various committees and advisory boards relate to cannabis in particular?
So cannabis has always been one of the major issues. The Runciman report, we realised at that time that because cannabis, of all the illegal drugs, so-called illegal drugs, was by far and away the one that was most widely used, we dedicated a separate chapter to cannabis. Cannabis does have a very special role when we think about drugs and drug harms because of the enormous amount of use. The fact that in some of our student populations, 80% of the students will have used cannabis, because in the time from 1970 to 2005, there have been a 20-fold increase in the number of people in Britain who've ever used cannabis, which translates into probably a 100-fold increase in the amount of use. So we always recognized that cannabis was a particularly important and a challenging drug that needed to be thought about in a different way to the other drugs because of its normalization in society. So I can say all those reports have quite a lot about cannabis. The Runciman report has a specific chapter which is still very well worth reading today in terms of the legislative approach to cannabis. But the Foresight report, cannabis, goes through there. A lot of interest in that report on the possibility of cannabinoid antagonists and the therapeutic development of those, for instance.
Have you been publicized in the media?
I've done quite a lot of work in the media. I haven't listed it all here. It's just too long and tedious. But yes, I think I'm now seen as the person in the UK who the media turn to if they want to get the truth about drugs, because I tell the truth. That's what got me dismissed from the government. And I'm very happy to talk to media, because I believe that the way forward in this whole debate is to have as much of the evidence in the public domain. So the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs that I set up has a website which I believe is the only truly independent website on drugs in the world. It's not influenced by drug users, it's not influenced by government. What you see there is what my expert panel, and they are special experts, have determined are the truths about the drugs. Many journalists go there and then they come to me for further details, or they go to other experts on my committee.
Given that you say the media tends to come to you for the truth about drugs, why would anyone not give the truth about drugs?
Well, as I suppose many in this room will realize, drugs are probably the most politicized branch of science. I'm trying to think of any other that's ever been as politicized as the drug debate. Global warming, well, the majority of scientists are on side. Drugs, scientists polarize. They polarize according to the source of funding and according to their religious and political beliefs. So it's extremely difficult to get right to the core truth about what drugs do and how harmful they may do. And of course it's complicated by the fact that drugs are illegal, and therefore research on drugs is limited, much too limited. So we have very little, very poor evidence about use, harms and therapeutic use. And of course this becomes a self-serving cycle. So little research is done on cannabis because it's illegal. It's very easy for people to say, well, there's not enough research to make it a medicine. But of course, that will always be the case, because the current legal situation makes research virtually impossible.
Going back to your having been broadcast in the media, tell us about some of the broadcasts and media.
Well, I'm proud of the Life Scientific. The Life Scientific is a recent program which takes top scientists and interviews them for half an hour in the same way as authors and conductors and musicians get treated as having a relevance to society. The Life Scientific is has a lot of listeners who are interested in learning about scientists, so that's a great honour to be on the Life Scientific. I've made BBC programmes, I've made Channel 4 programmes. The most recent one, which is not here, I did the first detailed imaging study of cannabis and cannabidiol, which we did as part of a Channel 4 broadcast. And I'm very keen to talk to schools and to the public. I spend a lot of my time giving lectures. I would really communicate to anyone who's interested in listening.
Lecturing?
Yes, well, I lecture a lot. I probably give 2 or 3 public lectures a week. I've lectured at the Cheltenham Science Festival several times. I lecture at scientific groups like the Café Scientifique, and also there's Skeptics in the Pub. And I give a lot of lectures to university science societies.
What is the Times Eureka Science magazine?
So the Times, you know the Times of London, it set up a weekly science magazine back in about 2009, and in 2010 it published its list of the 100 most influential scientists in Britain, and I was honoured to be one of those.
Were there other psychiatrists on the list?
No, I was the only psychiatrist.
And what is the John Maddox Prize from Nature/Sense about science?
So Nature, you probably know, the scientists here will know, Nature is one of the leading, perhaps the leading scientific journal in the world. It's been going for over 150 years. John Maddox was the editor for a very long time. John Maddox was an inspiration to me when I was a junior researcher. When I was doing some of my basic research, I was publishing in Nature. And when he died, his family and also the Cowan Foundation made a prize in his honor, and it's called the Nature Sense About Science Prize. Sense About Science is a British charity that promotes science. It does for other areas of science what drug science does for drugs. It tells the truth. It tells the truth about global warming. It tells the truth about obesity, etc. And every year there is an award of the John Maddox Prize, and it's given to individuals who have promoted good science in the face of opposition. And I was lucky enough to be the second awardee of that prize on the grounds that I was promoting the science of drugs in the face of being sacked by the government, which was considered considerable opposition at the time.
Under the heading Qualifications on page 150 of your CV, there's a laundry list of letters that appear there next to the years ranging from 1972 to 2002. For those of us not in the field, if you could just explain what those qualifications are.
So 1972, the BA, because Cambridge is a very old institution, it doesn't give BScs because it doesn't believe in science, so all doctors are BAs. And then in 1975, following my clinical training at Guy's Hospital, I then became a master, a BM, a Bachelor of Medicine, and a B Chair, a Bachelor of Surgery, which means I've got a medical degree. Then MRCP, member of the Royal College of Physicians in London. And then MA as a Master of Arts and an MB as a Bachelor of Medicine, etc. in Oxford. And then a DM, a Doctor of Medicine in Oxford. And then MRC Psych, member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists UK. FRC Psych, Fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. FMed Psy, Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences. And FRCP, Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians.
And then it says General Medical Council registration.
Yes.
That's your registration number.
That's my registration number as a doctor. Yes.
Take us through some of the positions you've held.
Well, I started off, I'm proud of this. Before I went to university, I went to Bristol University, worked for 6 months as a laboratory technician, working on those newly discovered substances called prostaglandins, which now turned out to be a very interesting aspect of medicine. And then when I qualified, I was a house physician, a resident back at my hospital, Guy's Hospital, and then various senior house officer jobs, senior residents, clinical scientist, where I did my research in Oxford, and then onto the Oxford training scheme as a registrar resident in psychiatry, then a lecturer in Oxford University, and then this senior fellowship, the Wellcome Senior Fellowship, which is a very prestigious, it's the top Wellcome Award. Very few scientists, let alone psychiatrists, get it. And then the Fogarty Scientist in NIH in Washington, and then came back to run the psychopharmacology unit, was made a professor in Bristol in '94. And then I did various jobs in the university as head of department, dean of medicine. And actually one of the reasons I went to Imperial in the end was to escape from all the management. Now I'm just back to research.
And you list a number of awards and prizes. Could you explain what those awards and prizes are?
Well, some scholarships to Oxford, open scholarship to Cambridge rather, and then those were some other scholarships to Cambridge. I won a few of the prizes at Guy's Hospital. I was one of their better students, I think.
What is the...
Sorry, my lord. Are we going to sit and listen to the wrestling of all this? We can see that.
So
I don't think there's any contention.
Do you
Line
accept
by
the
line,
CV
yes.
for purposes of this? Do you accept the witness's CV as set out?
Yes.
Is that what you said?
Yes, ma'am.
It's not in dispute.
It's not in dispute.
Mr.
Yes, my Lord. Certainly not much value in just reading them out, but an explanation of what they are. One doesn't know whether differing opinions between experts might turn on the nature of the qualifications, so an explanation of what they are would be of value to your Lordship.
Yes.
I'll ask the witness to focus
But
only on those.
awards and prizes, you think that needs to be explained?
No.
No, I'll move on.
I'll just comment on the Daily Telegraph, Britain of the Year, top 25. The Daily Telegraph is a rather right-wing newspaper, so that was a serious honour for me to be in the top 25 Britons from one of the newspapers that I find generally has the worst approach to my research. So.
Under the learned societies by examination or election, if you could just explain what they are and what they do.
Well, the Royal College of Physicians is the overarching body that awards the status of a physician. Psychiatrists, the Royal College does the same. The British Association of Psychopharmacology is an organisation that nurtures and promotes psychopharmacology, but it's non-selective. European College is the European equivalent of that. The CIMP is the international equivalent of that. And then the British Pharmacological Society is the professional group for pharmacologists.
You've already told us of your editorial capacity in the two journals referred to next.
Mr. Mahon, Mr. Bokaba indicated that they don't dispute the qualifications, etc. in the CV. It's very lengthy. Rather lengthy.
Yes, no. If it becomes a controversy, you can always go back to it and explain.
Yes.
Lord, am I to assume...
Perhaps a better approach would be to focus on the witness's CV only in relation, well, not only, but more in relation to the issue of cannabis or tobacco. Yeah. Because quite a lot is because of the extensive and wide experience of different drugs. So if we're going to go through the CV, it's going to take a very long time.
Certainly, Lord.
I will just ask Mr. Willis, do you, Mr. Willis, dispute or do you accept the CV? You don't?
No.
Thank you, my Lord. Perhaps I could pose it then in this more constructive way, my Lord.
Yes.
Professor, could you go through yourself and identify aspects of your CV which are noteworthy, given what you know to be the issues in this case?
Yes. So, if we go down to page 152, MRC, Addiction Field Review Working Party, 1992. So that was working to define the remit of the MRC in terms of addiction research. Alcohol Treatment Research Working Group, expertise in alcohol treatment. Neuroscience Advisory Board, academic research on addiction comes through that board. And then the ICAM Research Cluster, which was a major investment by the Medical Research Council in a group, my group, Cambridge and Manchester universities, to form the National Lead Centre for Addiction Research. And then, obviously, government responsibilities, the Advisory Council, I've talked about this. One thing I would say, and this is relevant, I believe, when I was chair of the Advisory Council, I pushed very hard and was successful in getting a cross-ministry group set up to look at drugs and drug harms, to try to build bridges between the different silos. Because one of the problems with drugs and drug harms is that they aren't just the province of the law or the health ministries or the judiciary or the transport. And there was no facility in the government at that time to talk across the whole remit of addiction. So I was pleased to be able to persuade my ministers that such a group should be set up. And then the other thing I'm very proud of is at the very bottom of that page, the scientific lead of this Foresight programme. I've mentioned it already. It was a truly landmark piece of work, and it stands the test of time today. And it covers all aspects of drugs, from economics right through to molecular science. I've given evidence on page 153 to many parliamentary committees. The House of Lords Committee on Cannabis is probably the one most relevant to this. This was a very interesting committee. It was a committee that I gave evidence to, and I can say honestly, thinking that it wasn't much of an issue. I was rather sceptical at the time about the claimed merits of herbal cannabis, plant cannabis. I argued that the availability at the time of THC as dronabinol and also synthetic THC as nabilone was adequate for research. But having given evidence and talked with that committee, I began to change my mind. And their report is a wonderful report, and I would commend it to all of you because their reports still stand the test of time 17 years on. I've spoken many times to select committees in Parliament, to interest groups in Parliament. I speak probably once or twice a year on drugs to all those. Just going down there. Yes, I've advised the Swedish government over a number of years on their research, particularly into alcohol, tobacco and other drugs. I've refereed huge numbers of grant applications. I consulted with a lot of pharma companies, very few of which are interested in addiction. That has been one of the saddest aspects of my life. I worked for a period for a company called Reckitt & Coleman. Reckitt & Coleman invented buprenorphine. They invented Subutex back in about 1982. I started working with them from about 1987. And I tried to persuade them that Subutex should be made available as a treatment for heroin addiction. And they refused. And even though I was their senior scientist, they refused to go into the field of addiction because they thought it would unsettle the shareholders. And they never got into that field while I worked for them. I worked for them for 4 years, and then they pulled out of research, so I left. And it was only about another 3 years later, when they were going bankrupt, that the National Institute of Drug Abuse in America paid for them to do studies that subsequently showed that we were right. Buprenorphine Subutex is a very, very valuable treatment for addiction. But that emphasizes the fact that when drugs are controlled and when you're working with people who have addiction problems, the pharmaceutical industry has almost zero interest in working in this field. And so of all these companies I've consulted for in the fields of addiction, of schizophrenia and anxiety and sleep disorders and depression, almost none of them have ever taken up suggestions I've made to move their products, where credible, into addiction.
Thank you. Mr. Professor, I see it's 4 o'clock now.
Yes,
Take the agenda. Thank you.
adjourn for today. Thank you. The court adjourns.
Cool.